Welcome to this particular session, which is all about the importance of groups and teams. Now, you will remember that so far, the stages that we have talked about, we've talked about recruiting people, we talked about selecting people, so in other words, choosing the right people. We talked about training them to give them the right skills. We've talked about managing them, how we manage people, whether we focus on the tasks or we focus on the people. So far at the moment, we've sort of really focused on two bits. We've focused on getting the right people in the first place, and also we've focused on managing them. We haven't really done the bit in the middle yet, and the bit in the middle is how do the workers get on with each other? How do they relate to each other? And also, we haven't really talked about why they bother working in the first place. So that's what we're going to talk about in Chapter 7, and then moving on, what we're going to talk about in Chapter 8 when we talk about motivation. So, as far as we're concerned for Chapter 7, we're going to talk very much about what happens when you put people together. Now, this is obviously very important. People don't act the same way together as they do when they're working as individuals. Now, remember, back when we were talking about recruitment and selection, one of the things that we mentioned was that you can have what's called an assessment centre. And an assessment centre looks at practical skills as well as just having an interview. So, for example, they might give you a test which is similar to what you'd have to do in real life. So you might have to perform a task. But one of the other things that we said is good about assessment centres is the fact that you can get people to work together and you can see how they act as a team. Now, up till now, apart from that little bit when we did recruitment and selection, we haven't really talked about people working together. And yet it's very, very important in real life. There are very few individuals who, as they work, actually work as individuals. At the moment, I am probably an unusual example of this because I am standing alone in a room with a camera. So I'm actually doing my job completely on my own. There is nobody else here. That's unusual. Most of you at work will spend your time, okay, you do your own tasks, but much of the time you will be working with other people. So it's very important from the company's point of view that we don't just think about individuals, but we think about how they would fit into a team, how they will fit into a group. Will they actually work together and increase the department's output, or will they actually work against each other and annoy each other and reduce the works department? So, groups and teams is what we're going to talk about in this particular section. First of all, let's just have a couple of definitions. So, what exactly do we mean by a group? A group is basically a collection of people. Not a particularly helpful definition, because it says a group is any collection of people who perceive themselves to be a group. In other words, a group is any collection of people who just think that they are a group. Now, why on earth would you think that you are part of a group? Well, for example, it might be that you have a shared identity. What that means is that you can all be referred to in the same way. So, for example, you could all be referred to as members of the finance department. That is a label, an identity that you all share. That would make you part of a group. You could perhaps be referred to, if you're sharing a house with other people, you could be referred to as the people who live at number 17, or whatever the house is that you perhaps live in. That makes you a group. Other people can identify you by knowing that you are one of those people. So a shared identity is often part of a group, so you can all be called the same thing. When I am talking to my students in class, we talk about the fact that they are the F1 evening class, or they are the F1 weekend group. they can be called one thing, and we all know who we're talking about. That means they're part of a group. There will often, in a group, be some kind of leader. We've already talked about leadership. We talked about it in previous chapters. We'll talk about it again later on. There will be loyalty. People will feel loyal to a group. They won't want to let the members of the group down. So a group has all these characteristics. Perhaps one of the most important ones is that they have what's called a common purpose. They are all trying to achieve the same thing. So the members in a department are all trying to work towards the same thing. The students in my classes are all trying to work towards the same thing, passing the exams. So everybody is trying to work together to achieve something. Now it says underneath that groups can be formal or groups can be informal. A formal group is one that is put together deliberately by somebody. Now, a formal group inside a company, inside an organisation, a formal group will be something like a division. It will be something like a department. Because somebody has decided that we need a group of people to do these tasks. We need a marketing department. We need a finance department. We need a human resources department. We need a committee to decide something. We need a task force to look at an issue. All of these are formal groups because somebody somewhere decides that we should have them. Now, an informal group, on the other hand, just sort of happens. People just get together. Often informal groups in organisations are social. So you get a group of people who decide that they're going to go out for a meal together, or they're going to go out to visit the theatre together, or they're going to go out for a drink together. One of the biggest informal groups that you get in lots of organisations is the people who smoke. Now, obviously, I don't know what it's like where you are, but in the UK at the moment, it's illegal to smoke inside most buildings. It's illegal to smoke inside most office space. So the smokers have to find somewhere to go. Well, that means that they probably think of themselves as a group because they will associate themselves with the other people that they see all the time when they're going out to have a cigarette. Now, nobody has made them do that. Nobody makes them all meet together. They just sort of decide to. So in an organisation, there are formal groups and there are informal groups. In your own life, there will be lots of informal groups that you belong to. Clubs that you are in, groups of family that you are in, groups of friends that you are in. And so we are members of lots and lots of different groups. In the exam, it's going to be important to think about which groups we want to have, which formal groups we want to have, and who should be in them. Now, groups are one thing, but they're not the same as teams. A group is simply a group of people, a collection of people who want to achieve something. A team is a group of people who have complementary skills. Now, that means that you deliberately have people who are good at different things, and you tend to make them work together. That's the key difference between a group and a team. So if I am talking to my students in a particular class and I say, are you a group? The answer is yes, because they are all referred to as students in that class. So they have a shared identity. They have a common purpose because they're all trying to pass the exam. But are they a team? The answer to that is no, because they don't have to work together. In fact, it would be cheating in the exam if they were working together, but they don't all have to work together to pass the exam. So they're not a team, but they are a group. Now, the best example that I can give you of a team, or at least an easy example I can give you of a team, is to do with sports. Because there are lots of sports teams that are around. football teams, basketball teams, etc. Now, the whole thing about those is, yes, they are a group of people. 11 players on a team or 5 players, whatever it happens to be. But you deliberately choose people with complementary skills. If I was the owner of a football club and I was trying to find the best 11 players in the world in order to play on my football club, what would happen if I went out and bought 11 goalkeepers who just happened to be the 11 best players in the world? Nobody would ever score any goals against me, but on the other hand, I probably wouldn't score any either. And the trouble would be I've got 11 players who are all the same. They're not complementary. So that actually wouldn't be a team. So you need a mixture of different people. You need people who can score goals as well as people who can stop them. So the idea is that if we are deliberately going to put a team together to do something, and in a few minutes we'll see why you would want to do that, if we're going to put together a team to do something, we need to think very carefully about who is going to be in that team. We need to make sure that people do have different skills. Now, I said at the start of this little section that we'd seen this before when we talked about assessment centres. And one of the reasons why an assessment centre is useful is not only can you see how people work together in a group of people, in a team of people, but you can start seeing what kind of skills they might have. It might not be technical skills. So we're not necessarily talking about do they know about their subject. We're talking about people skills. We're talking about, are they the kind of people who take charge? Are they the kind of people who listen to others? Are they the kind of people who perhaps support others' ideas? We're going to talk about that again later on. So you need a mixture of different people. Now, none of this would make any difference at all if having teams was a waste of time. But in a lot of circumstances, having a team of people doing something is a very, very good idea. It's a big improvement on having lots of individuals doing something. So, why are teams useful? Efficiency. You could have a number of tasks that need doing. So perhaps, for example, if you are working on a project, there might be 6 or 7 different tasks that need doing. Well, the advantage of a team is because you've chosen people who are good at different things, you could choose the best person for each task and get them to do it. So you might have to make, let's imagine, for example, that you are manufacturing something and you've got to manufacture 10 things. Each time you manufacture each of those 10 items, you've got to go through 6 stages. Get one worker to concentrate on each of those stages. So one worker does their own stage 10 different times. Now that would hopefully mean that you would be more efficient. So you can concentrate on people's strengths. So remember, the members of our team are going to have different skills that they are good at. Give each person something that they will be good at. That means it's going to be faster than giving everybody tasks, some of which they're good at and some of which they aren't good at. To a certain extent, the second point is really the same. Not only will we be able to work faster, because everybody's concentrating on what they're good at, but we all be the work we provide, the work we produce, ought to be better, because everybody's concentrating on what they're good at. Motivation. People will work harder. People will work harder for the simple reason that they are going to be concentrating on what they are good at, rather than having to do things that they aren't particularly good at. And you know as well as I do that people are more motivated when they're doing something that they enjoy. Blending skills might be particularly important. It might well be that we can perhaps learn from each other. So you bring 2 people together who've got complementary skills. Not only can they do those things well, but also they can learn things from each other, so they can end up being able to do more things and being good at more things. So you can actually get them to learn the skills from each other, and that could be a very important thing. For example, what you might deliberately do in a team is you might put together a very experienced person who's got lots of skills in some areas with a much more junior person who's got skills in other areas. And obviously as part of that, the experienced person will pass on some of their skills to the more junior person. They will develop them, something we saw earlier in the course. Hopefully, if you've got people who've got complementary skills, they will have lots of different ideas. So if everybody has got the same skill, then often they all think in the same way. So if you have people who've got different skills, they'll have different ideas, put them together, and they'll generate lots of ideas. There'll be lots of discussion. And that will lead to better decision making. If we have more ideas and we discuss them together, because people have got different things that they are good at, then we will have better decisions. Now, those last two are particularly important if you're thinking about running an organisation. Who runs companies? Now, you might argue it's the chief executive officer or the managing director or something like that. But to be honest, lots of companies are really run by the board of directors. A board of directors means you've got different people. You have definitely got a group of people, because they can be referred to as the board of directors, because they've got a common purpose, increasing the profit of the company. But they also ought to be a team. So you have got the marketing director, who is obviously good at one thing. You've got the IT director, good at something else. You've got the human resources director, good at a third thing. You've got the finance director, good at something else. So they are a team because they've got complementary skills. When they are having their discussions about what the company should do next, they will be able to generate more ideas. Because the finance director will think of certain things, the human resources director will think of other things. If you had a board of directors that was all made up of people from the finance department, then obviously they would only ever think about finance. So because you've got people from different departments, they will come up with different ideas, they will discuss them, they will talk about things from lots of different points of view. So when they end up making a decision, the decision ought to be better because they've thought about it from the human resources point of view and the information technology and the finance and the marketing points of view, rather than just looking at it from the finance point of view. So teams can be very, very useful, particularly at the top of an organisation, particularly when you need to get some kind of tasks done. Now, unfortunately, they are not brilliant. There are problems with teams. There always will be. So, in the exam, you might be asked to think about what the benefits of teams are, which we've just gone through. You might be asked to think what the problems are going to be. So, conflict. It's all very well us discussing lots of different ideas, but we have to agree on them, and some people won't. There will be conflict. I think my idea is better, even though everybody else is disagreeing with me. So there's going to be conflict. The more ideas you have, the more conflict there's going to be. Dealing with that conflict is actually a very important part of worrying about teams, so that you encourage lots of ideas, but people don't get fed up and angry and annoyed when their ideas aren't followed. The other problem we can have is what's called groupthink. Now, groupthink tends to happen when you have a team who have been together for a long time. So a team that have been together for a long time. The problem with groupthink is that people start to think in the same way. Even though you deliberately chose them to have complementary skills, after a while, they get so used to each other that they all start thinking the same way. And that can be one of the problems with a board of directors, is that after working together for 5, 10 years, they all start really agreeing with each other, and you don't come up with all these ideas that you did previously. That's why when you're talking about recruiting and selecting people, sometimes it is a good idea to deliberately bring somebody new in just to give you some fresh ideas. So groupthink can be a bit of a problem. Over the page, we're going to think about how teams actually get formed. So in other words, what do you have to think about when you're putting a team together? So we're going to do this in 2 particular bits. We're going to talk about the ideas of a guy called Belbin, and we're going to talk about the ideas of a guy called Tuckman. Now, both of these ideas are the sort of thing that in the exam, these are very, very easy to test. So they come up a lot. As I've said in previous chapters, the examiner will probably do one of 2 things when they're going to test Belbin and Tuckman, because they do this a lot. The first thing they will do is they will perhaps test your knowledge about, do you know what is in the theory? So, for example, they will say, here are 4 types of character that Belbin comes up with. 3 of them will be in the list that we're about to see, and 1 of them has been invented. So, in other words, you have to find the one that is wrong. That's a common type of question, and that's simply a knowledge question. You simply learn all the types of people that Belbin's talking about, and then you can identify the one that's missing. The other is an applied question, a practical question. The examiner will say, here is a member of a team, this is what they do, which kind of characteristic are they? So what would Belbin class them as? So you also need to be practical and be able to apply all of these. So the types of different roles that we have got as far as Belbin is concerned. We have got a plant. And the plant basically comes up with ideas. So in a team, the plant is the person who has all the inspiration and says, let's do this, let's do this, let's do that, let's do something else. So the plant is the person that has lots of ideas. Why is that an important person? What happens if you have a team and nobody ever comes up with any new ideas? Well, you're not going to get very far. So the ideas person. The resource investigator, they are mainly interested in things like getting resources for the team. If you are talking about the board of directors, that would be something like the purchasing director. So the board of directors says, right, we are going to do something, and the purchasing manager goes off and actually gets the materials, gets the labour, gets the machinery that we need. A resource investigator, very, very important. They actually spend most of their time dealing with people who aren't actually part of the team at all. They will be dealing with people from the outside world. The coordinator, I think that one is fairly obvious. The coordinator basically, I was about to say coordinates everybody, they basically organise everything. They organise the tasks. So they will say to the resource investigator, go and get some supplies. So they will basically be the person doing the day-to-day organising. They might not actually do very much of the tasks themselves. Their job is to make sure that somebody else is doing them. A shaper is the person who questions what we are doing. A shaper might be somebody who questions what we have done in the past. Why do we do it like that? If there is a good explanation for why we do it like that, then fine, the shaper will be quite happy. But if there isn't a good explanation, the shaper will say, why do we do it like that? And the team say, I don't know why we do it like that. Then it gives you a reason to try something different. Now, the plant and the shaper might be the same person. So the shaper says, why do we do it like that? Everybody says, I don't know. So the plant says, well, why don't we try it like this instead? So they might be the same person. And to be honest, often they are, but they don't have to be. One of the big things with Belbin, although there are a number of roles, you could have each role being done by a different person. But you can have some of the roles overlapping, and the plant and the shaper often are the same person, but they don't have to be. Somebody comes along and says, why do we do it like that? When the group say, I don't know, what are you going to do about it? The shaper says, well, I don't know either. So that's when the plant comes in and says, well, I've got an idea, why don't we try it like this? So you have the shaper. The monitor evaluator basically says, how are we doing? We have got tasks to complete. How close are we to finishing? Are we nearly at the end? Are we still near the beginning? Are we halfway through? Are we going to meet our targets, etc., etc.? Now, to be honest with you, when we're talking about teams, we're normally talking about a relatively small group of people. It might be 10, 11 people, might even be fewer than that. But an entire organisation is also a team to a certain extent. An entire organisation, an entire company needs plants and needs shapers, and they also need monitor evaluators. Now, in a company, where will you find the monitor evaluators? Which department are they in? Well, the most obvious one is that they're in finance. Because one of the things that we do is we do things like budgets, we do things like month end, so we look at how people are progressing compared to their budgets. A lot of the work that finance do is associated with being monitor evaluators. In other words, telling people how they're getting on. So remember what Belbin is saying is we need a mixture of all of these different people. If there is no plant, if nobody in a team plays the role of a plant, then nobody ever comes up with any ideas. We always just do what we've always done. If there is no monitor evaluator, then we don't know how we are doing. We don't know whether we're going to be successful or not. And presumably the team won't do very well. The team worker is very much there as a support for everybody else. The team worker is often the person who gets on with everybody else and tries to encourage them, tries to give them support. Obviously, they will have their own tasks to do as well. But often you find the team worker is somebody who's already doing something else and does that role as well. Now, I'm sure if you are working, you can think about most groups of people that you're with, particularly in your department. And there is usually one person, there might be more, but there is usually one person who is very supportive of everybody else and tries to help them as much as they can. That's the team worker. The implementer is basically the doer. All of these, the team that we've got has got a task to complete. And we've talked about people who come up with ideas. How should we complete the task? We've talked about people who say, where will the resources come from? I'll go and get what we need. We've talked about the monitor evaluator who says how we're doing, but so far we haven't actually had anybody who does anything. So that's where the implementer comes in. The implementer is the person who does it, and obviously that's going to be a key part of any team. The completer finisher is, to a certain extent, the exact opposite of the plant. The big problem that you have with plants is that they often come up with lots of ideas, but they never do anything about them. They never actually get started on them. They can often be very abstract. So what we need then is we need somebody, an implementer, to actually do things. But the trouble is, as you well know, as you get towards the end of a task, often you get bogged down, you get involved in lots and lots of details. Now, the completer finisher is somebody who is very good at those details. Again, if you look, for example, at a lot of tasks that you have a project. Let's say, for example, you're doing an audit of a company. And obviously, auditing is something that you guys are going to be looking at when you do some of your later exams. When you first start an audit, there's lots and lots and lots of things that need doing, and everybody quite happily goes off doing their own thing. There would be lots of people implementing that audit. They're going off and looking at their own particular section. And you can quite happily leave them to get on and do things. The things that get done first on an audit, like any kind of project, are often the easiest and the most straightforward things. As the audit progresses, often the easy bits are done and you then start having to focus on details. Have you done that little bit? Has this little bit been completed? Yeah? When you start an audit, you often leave lots of bits. You say, I'll come back and do that later on. Or there's something where you think, I need to find out something and I'll come back and find it later on. So you start out with all the easy bits. You often don't finish any of them. You do most of them, and then you go on and do another easy bit, and you do another easy bit. Eventually, though, you've got to finish everything off. Some people are very, very good at details. Some people aren't. You may well have heard of people who say things like, the phrase that I've come across is, I think in broad terms, or I'm a broad brush person. What they mean is they're not very good at details. Either they're not interested, or they haven't got the patience, or they may not have the skills. That's where your complete the finisher comes in. Somebody has got to be interested in the details, because otherwise we might miss something, and that's often where people go wrong. That's often where projects go entirely wrong. There is a story, and I don't know how true it is. I read about it many, many years ago, but there was a story about when the Americans were trying to put somebody on the moon. So they went through various stages of various rockets, etc., etc., etc. You obviously had a team of people working to develop rockets to put people that eventually was going to lead to put people on the moon. So you had lots of people on the team. You had plants, and you had monitor evaluators, and you had resource invigilators. But you also had computer programmers. Now, they would be implementers writing computer code, but you also needed some finishers. You needed some detailed people who would check all of the lines of code. Now, as I say, there is a story, and I know that I've read this quite a few times, but I have no evidence that it's true or not, that they were developing a rocket that was going to eventually turn into something that was going to take people to the moon. So they built a test one, a smaller version. But it still cost tens of millions of dollars. And so the day for the big launch came. They had all the people. They invited lots of dignitaries. They invited lots of important people to see this rocket being tested. So they fired it. It went straight up in the air for about 200 metres, turned around and came straight back down again into the earth and exploded. And when they were trying to work out why on earth that had happened, they went through all the computer code, and the story is that there was a minus sign where there should have been a plus sign in one of the lines of computer code. And because of that, they managed to wreck a $10 million rocket in about 3.5 seconds. Now, why did that happen? Because somebody didn't look at the details. Maybe that was because they didn't actually have anybody that was good at looking at the details. So, completer finishers are very, very necessary inside a team. Somebody's got to be able to look at the details. You can imagine that if we put together this team, it will be complementary. We've deliberately putting together a team who've got lots of complementary skills. I'm sure you can also imagine there'll be lots of arguments. The plants and the completer finishers won't like each other, because the plants are very much, I've got an idea, but I'm not interested in how to do it. I'm certainly not interested in details. Those two people will not get on very well together. So it's very unusual that you find somebody that actually does both of those roles. The final bit we've got there is a specialist. So again, when I was an auditor, normally there would be I would work with the same kinds of people. There were people in my office that I would work relatively regularly with on various audits. You'd put together a team of people, then it would split up, then you'd work together with another team of people, and then they would split up. Maybe after 2 or 3 months, you'd come back and work with the same people again. So you tended to work with the same kind of people. Occasionally, we would have an audit which was fairly specialised, something we didn't deal with very often. I remember when I was an auditor, most of our clients were manufacturers because of the nature of where the office was based. But we did have one client who was a financial services company. And most of us didn't really know anything about financial services, certainly not from the point of view of auditing. So we had some specialists, some people who just joined the team just for that particular audit because they knew about that, and that was the only time we ever saw them. So you've got a range of different people, you've got a range of different skills. So Belbin says that when you are recruiting people to join a team, they may already work for a company and you're going to put them on a team. You don't want everybody being the same. So you don't want everybody that's a monitor evaluator. You don't want everybody that's an implementer. You need a mixture of different kinds of people. Now that might mean that when you're putting a team together, you deliberately include people from other departments, from other parts of the organisation that will bring different skills. Now, one of the teams that is in an organisation that you need to be aware of, because obviously you're part of it, will be the finance team. Now, the big problem with the finance team is you have probably got already quite a lot of monitor evaluators, because that, to be honest, is what accountants do. You may well have, I would hope, lots of implementers who do the job, and I would also hope you get lots of team workers who will help everybody else. Accountants also tend to be good at details. I know that is a generalisation, but accountants in general are fairly good at looking at details. The trouble is that you don't necessarily have anybody to come up with any ideas. You don't necessarily have anybody who questions what we are doing at the moment. So the big problem in your organisation might well be that you keep doing what you have always done. You keep doing the same reports every month. You keep using the same internal controls that you've had in the past. Why? Firstly, because nobody ever questions whether they're still appropriate. And even if they did, there is nobody to come up with a fresh idea. Well, why don't we do it like this instead? So even in the finance department, you really need shapers and you really need plants. Now, that might mean that when you are selecting people to join the finance department, you ignore their technical skills, or at least you don't really pay a lot of attention to it. Most accountants have got relatively similar technical skills, or you could argue that they have got similar technical skills. If they've all passed the same exams, they can all do the same things. I would accept some of them will have more experience in an area than others. But maybe what people should particularly look for when they're talking about selection is, should we get some more plants? Should we get some more shapers? Should we get people who think in a different way? Because that would actually make the finance department better. Now, you can use exactly the same argument about lots of other departments. If you go to the marketing department, I suspect you'll find lots of shapers and I suspect you'll find lots of plants. I'm not sure you would find as many completer finishers. So again, if they're recruiting and selecting for that department, maybe they look for people with a slightly different personality. And again, maybe they look for people who aren't particularly technical. What they look for is the personality instead. If you remember when we talked about recruitment and selection, we did talk about what was called a person specification. And maybe what we need to look for then is somebody who fulfills one of Belbin's criteria and not worry too much about their technical skills. There'll be enough other people in finance who can do some accounting. There'll be enough other people in marketing who can do a campaign. Maybe what we need to do is come up with the right kind of personality. So in the exam, one thing that might happen is the examiner gives you 3 of those and gives you one that the examiner has made up, You have to find the odd one out. Or what you may have is here is a particular person in a team, here is what they do, what role are they filling? So Belbin, I think Belbin is not only a very sensible theory, I think it's actually also an interesting one, because I hope that you can identify yourself in one of those categories, and hopefully you can also identify the people you work with in one of those categories. So, we've talked then about the kinds of personalities that you need if you're in a group. The other big theory that we have in this particular chapter is how do groups get together. Now, I'll be honest with you, when I have done this theory, the theory of Tuckman with other groups, students like this one. It's one of the easiest ones to remember, because the four main stages that Tuckman says that a group goes through, they talk about forming, storming, norming and performing. So it's fairly easy to remember. So, forming is when you initially get together. When your group, when your team initially meets. The storming stage. The storming stage is what's known as competition for leadership. So competition for leadership basically means who is going to be the boss, who's going to be the leader who organises everybody else. We'll come back and talk about that in a second. Norming is where we all agree on what to do. Now let's just talk about those three stages first of all. If you remember, we mentioned a little while ago that you can have formal groups and you can have informal groups. A formal group is one where somebody has decided that it should get together. Somebody's decided that this group, this team, is necessary. So, a department in an organisation, a committee in an organisation, a group of people who will meet regularly to discuss ideas in an organisation. But somebody's decided it's going to get together. That often will also mean that they will decide who is on this group, who is on this team. So, the forming stage, they get together for the first time and they meet. The first time a committee meets. You've set up a new department, you have allocated some office space, you've recruited people maybe from outside or maybe from inside, and they all meet together in the office for the first time. So that's the forming stage. The storming stage, in a formal group, there will be a boss, there will be a manager, the head of department, the chair of the committee. There will be somebody who is designated as the person in charge. But what the competition for leadership there means is often the boss, the manager, listens to some people more than others. So what you want to do is you want the manager, you want the person in charge to listen to you rather than to somebody else. So that's where the competition for leadership comes in a formal group. Norming, we agree on what we're going to do. So this group is going to meet every second Wednesday of the month, and we will have a 3-hour meeting where we'll talk about what we're going to do. This department is going to carry out its tasks in this particular way, so we agree what we're going to do. The performing stage is where we get the tasks done. Now, how long does it take a formal group to get from the first stage down to the last stage? It could be weeks. It could be months. It could even be years. A good example of this would be something like the European Union. The European Union is a group. It's a very, very large group. Every time there are some new countries that are admitted to the European Union, they have to go through a new formation, because it's now a fresh group, because you've got more people in it. So you now need to get together with more countries in it. There will be storming. Now, the new countries, how important are they going to be? The norming stage, the new countries particularly have to get used to how the other people do something before they can start performing. Now, that could take years. Even if you have got a small company, it can still take time. A very good example of this in real life will be something like when you get two companies who join together. There could be a merger, there could be an acquisition, and you now start mixing the departments together. So you had two separate finance departments, and now you put them together. You go through exactly this process. So there's two finance departments. They now need to meet for the first time as one big finance department forming. Competition for leadership. We had two finance departments. We had two managers. Who's going to be in charge now? The norming. We did something in one way. We did it in a different way. We now need to agree. And it might take a while before you actually get those things done. There have been numerous examples in the past of where companies have tried to come together with mergers, with acquisitions, and it hasn't been successful. And one of the reasons why it hasn't worked is because of all these four stages. Companies often get stuck at those two. They can't work out who the boss is, so they can't really ever agree what they're going to try and do. And then they can't agree how to do it. So it can be a big problem. Now, that's all to do with formal groups. Informal groups are just basically groups of your friends. So you decide that you're going to go out for a meal. So you're perhaps going to meet somewhere, then you're going to go on to the restaurant afterwards for your meal. The forming stage, you get together. If it's a group of you who know each other, fine. But there might be people who are coming along for the first time. The storming stage, even if you are a group of friends and you are meeting somewhere and then you're going to go on to a restaurant, somebody has to say, I think it's time that we left. If nobody says that, you never get to the restaurant. So somebody's going to have to say that. Now, often it's fairly obvious who it's going to be. You don't have a vote on it. Just somebody, it's just obvious they are going to be the person who's in charge. The norming stage, agreeing on what we're going to do. You go out with a group of people for a meal. Fine. Do we all pay for our own meal? Do we all basically take the meal and share it out equally? Do we all pay for our own drinks and share the food between all of us? What does your group agree to do? And it's going to be different. I go out for meals with different groups of people, and we do it in different ways depending who I'm with. You all have to agree on it. You have to go through those stages before you get to the performing bit, which is either a formal group gets its tasks done or an informal group gets to eat. So you've got those four stages. Those four are very, very important. Now, leading on for that, you've got another two stages. These aren't as important, and these were actually added after Tuckman's original theory. So he didn't originally come up with these. Other people have added them on afterwards. The dorming stage is where you get complacent. It means that you've been together as a group for so long that you just automatically do the same thing over and over and over and over again without necessarily thinking about it. If it was a group of people going out for a meal, they've now got to stage they always go to the same restaurant, which of course wouldn't really be particularly interesting. If it's a group of workers, they've now settled down and they just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. If you remember, a little while ago, we talked about what's known as groupthink. Groupthink is where you've got into that. You just do the same thing. Now, that may well mean that you are not generating any ideas. You're not coming up with anything new. So that can often mean that you become less effective. In other words, you're not as good as you used to be because you just do the same thing over again and nobody can be bothered to think of anything new. So dorming is a bad stage. The other two we've got is what's called morning and adjourning. Morning and adjourning are basically the same thing. The group splits up. The team splits up. The only difference is that morning, it's permanent. The group is never, ever getting together again. So the task that needed doing is done. That team's never getting together again. Adjourning means that they're going to reform at a later date. So they're having a break, and then they'll get back together again. So again, working as an auditor, you worked on lots of teams that adjourned. So you did an audit for a company, and then you stopped, and then the same time next year, when you went back to the client again, a lot of the people would be the same. Wouldn't be identical, but a lot of them would be the same. So that's adjourning. On the other hand, if you work for something which is one-off, once it's finished, that's the end of it. Now again, you need to know those two because, along with the other four, the examiner could say, here are some stages. Which one is the odd one out? Which one is he invented? The examiner could also say, he can't do this with Belbin, but he can do it with Tuckman. The examiner could say, put them in the right order. So he's actually got the right ideas, but he's put them round the wrong way, and you have to put them back into the right order: forming, storming, norming, performing. Alternatively, the examiner could say, here is a group, this is the stage that they have got to. They are all doing this, they are all doing that. Which stage is it? So the examiner says, you've got a group, and, for example, they are perhaps meeting for the first time. So that's obviously the forming stage. They are perhaps agreeing on the procedures that they are going to follow later on. Well, that's the norming stage. The examiner will tell you what they're doing and say which stage have they got to. The final bit that we've got, as far as teams and groups are concerned, is to do with what's called team effectiveness. Team effectiveness is basically to do with the fact that we want teams to do well. We want them to be effective. Effective means that they do a better job. What kind of things make a team better? You can see here the word cohesion. Cohesion is a fancy word that basically says, here are some things that make people work together better. If they work better together, they will be a better group together. They'll be more effective together. So the kind of things that we might look for is things like the size of our team. If the team is too small, you don't get enough ideas. Belbin would say there aren't enough different people. If the team is too big, then there's too many room for conflict. So a small team, round about 10 to 15, is often the right amount, is often the right size. Anything more than that, it's too many, you can't get anything done. Anything smaller than that, then actually there's not enough variety. It's quite interesting that if you look at sports teams, if you look at team events, an awful lot of them have the numbers of people on a team somewhere between about 8 and 12. 11 is very common for some reason. You don't tend to get team sports of more than 20. The biggest that I can think of offhand is a rugby team, a rugby union team that has 15. I'm not aware of any teams that are bigger, although there may well be. You don't tend to have them much below that. Again, the only sports that I can think of that are below that is something like basketball, where you have 5. But you don't get many team sports which are fewer than 5 or bigger than 15, because it's either fewer than 5, there's not enough different skills. Bigger than 15, there's just too many people. They just won't be able to do something together. So team size is important. Bigger than something, it's too many. Smaller than something, you don't get enough ideas. Homogeneity of members. That simply means, are they similar? People who are similar get on together. They will get on better. People who are similar will think similar things and therefore will be effective. You've obviously noticed that there was a problem with that because Belbin have said we want people who are different. Trying to get that together, similar enough but different enough, is a very great skill when you're trying to put a good team together. If there is an external threat, people work better together if they're trying to defend what they are doing. So if you have got a big rival competitor who has just launched a new product, your groups of people, your teams of people will work better because they'll want to try and make sure that the rivals' products don't do particularly well. Rewarding people. Obviously, if you reward people, they will do better, and we'll see that when we come to motivation later on. Leadership. Strong leaders give the team a lot of direction. They don't tell them what to do, but they say, I want you to achieve this. I want you to develop this new product which is going to have these features. I won't tell you how to do it, but I'm very clear what I actually want you to achieve. Weak leaders, it won't be obvious what the team's got to do. What exactly is the task that we have to do? And if you don't know what the task is, you won't do a very good job. And finally, similar kind of idea, goal congruence, we have to work together. Goal congruence means that if everybody succeeds at their own individual task, then the group will succeed. It's very easy in a big organisation to have one person succeeding will mean another person can't succeed. You want to try and get rid of that. So goal congruence, everybody's working together. Now it might be that your groups don't work particularly well. They're perhaps not as effective as you would like. And you have a list there of reasons why that might happen. I think most of those are fairly obvious. For example, not clear what you're supposed to be achieving, your objectives. Perhaps undeveloped individuals. That simply means that people haven't got the skills that they need. So the examiner may give you a list and say, why don't groups work well? I think that one is fairly obvious. The final bit that I just want to do as far as groups and teams are concerned is just to mention committees, because committees are very common kinds of groups. All I've got there is temporary or permanent. A temporary committee is set up to solve a particular problem and then it disappears. The big issue with temporary groups is they still have to go through Tuckman, and by the time they've gone through all those things, it can take them a long time, which means they may not be as effective as they could be. A permanent committee is one that is there permanently. All that changes is occasionally new people will join, old people will leave. So a board of directors, you might have a finance director who leaves, retires, gets replaced by somebody else. It's still the same kind of committee. So groups and teams, very, very important.